In this video, I'll be talking about outline stitch and stem stitch, and I grouped them together because they're made almost exactly the same way with only a little variation, and so it made sense to teach them together. They look very similar at the end as well, and you may find that one is just a little bit better for your project than the other. So in purple we have outline stitch, in blue I have stem stitch, and then I have a little tendril of green stem stitch here. Let's talk about how you make a stem stitch and an outline stitch and what the difference is. So these stitches are always worked from left to right or from bottom to top if your hoop is turned. So I'm working from this side of my line, so this is my bottom, and I'm going to take a stitch down, maybe somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch away. 1/8 is a little small on a straight line, 1/4 is a little long, and I'm going to come up around the midpoint, maybe just a little shy of the midpoint, and bring my thread up. And you'll notice that I'm pulling my thread towards me, towards the bottom of my line as I'm working. So you take that stitch and you're going to come almost back to the previous stitch. This is similar to your back stitch on the back, only it's actually going to look like a running stitch on the back. But it's a very similar mechanism where you're taking a stitch and then you're coming back part of the way, not to meet, but almost meet, and then taking another stitch. So when you pull the line, your thread towards you as you work along the line, and work with your thread along the bottom, this is a stem stitch. If you do the opposite and take the thread and keep it above the line as you work, that's an outline stitch. And they're going to look very similar, and actually I learned that they were basically the same stitch. I was always taught that as you worked around a curve, like I'll show you in a minute, that you should always have your thread to the outside of the curve because it made for a neater line. And actually that's not entirely true. That has you switching between stem stitch and outline stitch, and your stitches will look different. So there's no reason to switch back and forth between them. If you're using one or the other, just stick with it through the entire line that you're doing. So that's pretty easy when it's on a straight line. Let's talk about what happens when you go around a curve. So I'm facing this design from the bottom. So if I were to start my curve, I would be stitching from here, from the bottom. And as I go around, that bottom does not change. So for on this first curve where it's this swirling this direction, my stitches are going to be with the thread pulled to the outside of that curve for a stem stitch. But as I curve around the other direction, my thread's going to be pulled to the inside because that's still the bottom of the line if you were switching your hoop as you worked. So don't switch midstream and start putting your stitches on the outside because that would take you from stem stitch to outline stitch. So for either one, you're going to stay on whichever side you started. And for stem stitch, you're going to work from the bottom or the right if it's turned. And for outline stitch, you're going to work from the top or the left if you're working from the bottom up. So I've zoomed in on this so that you can see a little bit more detail about making a stem stitch. As I go around a straight line or a gentler curve, I've made my stitches a little bit longer. They're a little shorter than 1/4 of an inch. But as I get to this end where the curve is going to get tighter, I start shortening them so that I can go into really short stitches around this curve so that it keeps to the shape better. In these short stitches, you're really going to be almost doubling up every single stitch because they're so short and they've got so much overlap. Whereas these ones, there's at least a little small section where there's not any overlap. And it's going to look a little bit thinner and neater that way. And it might look a little bulkier as you move along, but that is the nature of the stitch. So longer stitches on softer curves, smaller stitches on shorter curves, and make sure to transition between the two. Since stem stitch is good for curves, I used it in the circle sampler for any stems that I wanted to have more of a curve instead of a straight line. So these little ones I used stem stitch on. There's also some stem stitch in this for these curved stems. For the alphabet, I've used this already on the O, but it's also going to be great for any other letters with a lot of curve to it. So the R or the G, anything that goes around all of those curves is going to be great with stem stitch.